So let's talk through every single faction in Warhammer 40k and roughly how strong they're looking right now in a tier list. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking 40k army power, and in this video I thought we'd go through each faction in the game, roughly how I'd rate them for power in the context of the latest balance updates, some of their strongest attachments and units going forward, and perhaps any issues that the faction faces. Warhammer 40k certainly seems to have had a fair bunch of shake-ups recently, lots of new points costs, really quite a lot of recent codex releases, and a big nightly update just the other day as well. It's going to be interesting to see what falls out of all of that and winds up winning games and tournaments as a result. Prior to Games Workshop's big rule changes with the latest balanced data slate, faction balance didn't seem to have been in too bad a spot. The vast majority of the game's factions within their previous stated target of 45 to 55% wins, a few falling off the bottom with the Imperial Agents, Tau and Black Templars, and a few just nosing out the top with things like Deathguard Knights and the Aeldari. Generally, I still say that game balance in Warhammer 40k is looking pretty good, at least in terms of faction versus faction. A good player with a strong list played well for each army has a pretty good chance of doing well versus their competitors, though as ever there certainly looks like there's armies that seem to be performing better than others. I say quite a few factions that just feel like they're nosing their way out of the top at the moment, as opposed to too many that are left in the dust. With that in mind, I thought we could talk through each faction in the game and roughly where they might rank right now. Obviously this is very early days, and I'm sure some of this will wind up being wrong to a greater or lesser degree, largely based on where things were before, plus the changes that Games Workshop made, and maybe just a tiny bit on the first inklings of data that we've had from the first tournament weekend. I'll certainly be looking forward to seeing how things actually unfold when we get some more data in though, of course. In any case, for this one I've chosen to rank the 40k armies into 4 main tiers and 1 S tier. I chose to split tier 2 into 2 halves, a slight upper and lower one, just for the armies that I feel like might punch up a little bit more consistently. Obviously I'd always take tier lists in Warhammer 40k with a grain of salt. They're going to vary a lot depending on exactly how you play the army, what sort of terrain that you have and what sort of opponents that you might be playing, and in particular whether you're playing more casual or competitive games. Some armies do far better at a casual level, with just a fair bit of raw power versus sneaky tricks that might work better in grand tournaments and things. For my videos I often tend to focus more on win rates and sort of mid-level performance, as I feel like that's far more useful to the majority of players out there, rather than the select few elites who are competing for the tops of grand tournaments. But I'll aim to talk through a bit of both as we go along, and maybe highlight a few factions that I suspect probably won't do great from the average player's perspective, but have more potential to punch up towards grand tournament success than others. In any case, let's jump into it, talk through the armies and have a bit of a chat about where they are and their faction balance in the game currently. First up, and probably to no one's surprise, in tier 4 we've got the army with more issues than any other army, the Imperial Agents. Initially built and released as a faction, but Games Workshop don't seem to have treated them as a standard 40k faction for balance purposes. Things haven't really changed for them so much, so I'll cover briefly. Tournament stats tend to be kind of meaningless just due to how few people play the faction. I think overall for the last update it was around about 36% win rates though. In general these guys are going to be playing 40k on ultra hard mode and being forced into the pigeonhole of trying to do annoying chaff scoring things, as opposed to actually dealing damage, given that they just don't really have efficient damage dealers in the codex compared with other armies. In the last balance update they didn't get any changes, though I guess the new knight changes might mean that their armoured support has got more interesting. I'd guess that if you're playing Agents, Canis Rex will be an absolute auto-include now. Their faction rule doesn't have a main army one, it's more an allied one, which is a definite source of weakness versus all the armies that do have their own army rule when they're fielded as their own faction, and players try to make them work usually with Imperialist fleets, with multiple units of things like Navy Breachers and Subductor squads, some lone operative assassins, Kyriadraxus for hard units to engage, and then to eke out games via board control and scoring points. As ever, the army has absolutely huge issues. They ideally need some way to deal with enemy heavies and monsters and vehicles in faction. An army rule would probably be a good way to implement that, and even if they do get a bit more powerful, internal balance isn't great, with the auto-specific detachments having kind of limited effect. The biggest problem is that Games Workshop don't look like they're treating them as a normal faction, so aren't really very likely to get balance updates anytime soon. Not ideal for players who bought into the faction, particularly given that Games Workshop didn't really make it clear that they wouldn't be treated in the same way as other armies, so fingers crossed at some point they decide to reverse course and help them out. Moving upwards, and in tier 3 I've chosen to rank these armies. I feel like in 40k at the moment there's actually surprisingly few armies that really stick out at the bottom in terms of being notably weak compared with the rest of them out there. Here I've chosen to rank the Black Templars, Adeptus Mechanicus and Orks, though I'd certainly heavily caveat by saying that these guys I don't think are really significantly behind the armies in tier 2 whatsoever. They all have their strengths, and in the hands of a good player with a top army list could absolutely be taking down grand tournaments. I just guess that these guys on average will have more trouble than the average army currently, though not by a significant amount. Overall, if anything, this feels fairly positive for 40k game balance. Plenty of good things to say about even some of the armies that might rate less powerful right now. For the Black Templars, they were having trouble pre-update. They had win rates at 42%, one of the lowest in the game besides the Agents, and they fight as a supplement to Codex Space Marines, using Oath of Moment for their core rule. They have their one main index attachment at the moment while they wait for their Codex, with their vows from Righteous Crusaders to give them various melee damage buffs or 6+ feel no pain, and generally tend to have a melee focus with things rewarding combat. For the latest balance changes, fortunately Games Workshop did give them some small improvements. Hellbrets and Grimaldus dropping down, Soul Brethren dropping down to 140, and Crusader squads going down a little bit, including a few changes to core Codex Space Marines. I feel like it was a definite step in the right direction, though maybe a kind of small one really. Just given how far they seem to be behind on paper, it doesn't really feel like it's going to enormously catch them up. Soul Brethren and High Marshal Hellbret feel like the single biggest draws to the faction after the changes. 4-5 with him, that'll now be 260 points rather than 280, so a bit more efficiency there. And there are other things that are well worth using for the army, tanks with bolt-on multi-melters, various ways to get a 5+ feel no pain, either for Crusader squads or maybe a big unit of Assault Terminators. The Emperor's Champion is still good, as is Grimaldus. I just still guess that with a few small 10 points buffs, they aren't going to rise up as much as you'd hope them to. Though I guess whatever happens here is going to be kind of short-lived, given that their Codex isn't all that far away, maybe a couple of months out. Next up, we've got the Adeptus Mechanicus, that pre-update had tournament win rates of around about 45%, so again certainly on the lower end of Warhammer 40k. Not many people tended to be playing them, and they didn't really have all that much success at the tops of grand tournaments. For their core mechanics, they get the Doctriner imperatives, so either shooting hard with Protector or being able to move fast, hit hard in melee and get extra AP with Conqueror if they're near battle line. An army list tended to use the Halo Screed detachment and the Skitarii Hunter cohort, the Halo Screed being the more popular as it supports quite a bunch of the army with things like extra shooty cast from breaches, some good use for Castellan robots, and Skitarii are good in either formation, with Rangers and Vanguard being a staple for the buff, and then most of their skirmish infantry units being rather solid, Infiltrators, Rust Stalkers and Taraxi. For the last balance changes, their Castellan robots got Doctriners outright now, so they're more efficient everywhere that they are. Having the Conqueror Doctriner on them will be nice. Scorpius tanks got 10 points cheaper, which does feel like a fairly direct power buff, given that lots of people were already using those for anti-tank. And then both the Iron Strider and the Taser Lance Dragoon both dropped 5 points as well. And again, they were already pretty usable, so fairly nice to have them underlined as options once more. None of those are going to help out for Admech on the points per money front though. Overall, doesn't really feel like Admech lists might change huge amounts from that, but might just have a little bit more wiggle room on the points front. They also gain that Battleclade unit, though it feels like a bit of a hard sell versus the Battle Line squads that provide buffs. Again, like the Black Templars though, I'm a bit apprehensive as to whether or not these small points increases will be enough to really break them out of the lower sort of bracket of 40k. Again, they feel like a step in the right direction, but not an enormous one, particularly in the context of lots of other armies getting buffs, and plenty of stuff at the top end of the game getting perhaps even stronger. Finally, for armies that have ranked down here, we've got the Orks. Pre-updates, their tournament stats had win rates of 48%, and were at least having a fair bit of success on the top tables of grand tournaments, even after the rather obscene power of Mordaka was nerfed into the ground. The Orks, as ever, can deal out a whole bunch of melee violence, lots of big hitting power, and then overlapping speed, damage and durability buffs on their turn of the war, often playing as sort of pressure armies, rushing the foe and dealing a lot of damage. In the latest balance update, Buggies, Copters and Squighog Boys got a bit cheaper. Cult of Speed got a buff with Advance, Shoot and Charge on all the speed freaks there, though still doesn't initially look like people are overly excited to play that one versus the competition. Unfortunately, it came with really quite a lot of very specific nerfs that hit a bunch of top Orc builds. The Shock Attack Gun Mechs. The Shock Attack Gun Mech's quite good for Dread Mob or Tactical, and he went up. So did 10 squads of Looters. Big Flash Git units also hit the Tactical Brigade more. Large squads of Boys went up to 170. And staples like the Trucks and Tank Busters went up by small amounts as well. Out of the detachments, it feels like maybe Warhorde lost out less than Tactical Brigade, so I feel like it might encourage more people to play that than before. It was already the dominant detachment, probably more so now. It feels like it's probably going to lean Orks into yet more melee violence in Trucks and Battle Wagons, Boys Knobs, Breaker Boys, Beast Snagger Boys, and maybe some Mega Knobs with Ghazghkull Thracker, often led by War Bosses or Beast Bosses. Maybe some Flash Kits and Tank Busters to also hang out in the trucks and strike with a bit of shooting. The Flash Kits also having plenty of melee as well. Gretchen are nice for farming command points and super efficient, Storm Boys bouncing around the board to score objectives, and then I guess trucks might just have a tiny bit more competition from kill rigs or battle wagons after going up a touch. They still are a very nice way to get boys into battle from A to B. I'd guess that with a few targeted nerfs to top builds, the greenskins might not have such a great time, particularly going from a sort of middling win rate level. It certainly seems their first weekend post-data slate was a very bad one for them. Still early days on that front. I'd guess they'll wind up being an army with a pretty low win rate, but occasionally still people take them to the tops of grand tournaments. It does feel like they've overall lost power to me though, and the points drops aren't really going to compensate for the nerfs. Before we move onwards and upwards, I'll just give a quick shout out to Titans Terrain, the video sponsor. They're one option for getting a battlefield worth of Warhammer 40k terrain on the board, but their system is really quite different to the vast majority out there. Basically you have a 3x4 tile grid, so 12 tiles that unfold, and each one of those cardboard tiles basically has a pop-up building on it. They have a battlefield that stores flat, and then it springs up to make cardboard terrain structures when you unfold it. It's definitely a bit different to the vast majority of things out there. Probably the biggest unique selling point is that it's really quite easy to store and transport, as it basically means that you can have an entire battlefield that can really be quite quickly assembled and disassembled and stored in a box set the same size as a standard board game. That's quite good for some people whose space might be limited, storing it at home, or if you want to take some terrain around to play at a friend's house or something. The cardboard construction does have a few trade-offs, some real advantages but also some downsides versus more normal terrain, and I'll talk through those at the end of the video for those who are interested. In any case though, a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one, and you can find them linked in the video description if you'd like to check them out. Moving onwards and upwards though, and next up let's go to Tier 2, armies that are considered to be fairly well balanced as Warhammer 40k goes right now, at least with their top builds played well, able to punch up and challenge the best stuff in the game, but maybe not quite as consistently stand out and seemingly overly powerful as some armies fail to be. It seems I've chosen to rank basically over half the factions in the game in this one at this point, which would be a good thing if this does wind up broadly reflecting reality. It does seem that most armies do have genuinely interesting and powerful stuff that they can put on the tabletop, but will still maybe have a slightly harder time than optimised lists from stuff that are put higher up the list, or just a little bit more breakdown. I've ranked these into an upper half and a lower half, maybe with the armies that I expect to be pushing up on the next tier a bit more compared with the rest. So let's go through the ones that I've put in the lower half first, and then move on to the upper. First up here, I've ranked the Dark Angels. They weren't in a particularly great spot pre-update. Win rates are around about 45%, and while they did get some interesting changes from the balance update, they got their new Wrath of the Rock detachment and some pretty cool buffs to Lionel Johnson. It doesn't look like it's initially working out for them very well at all. Seems that they had lots of people playing them and trying them out, but they really did very badly in the first weekend's tournament stats. Whether that's representative of them going forward or not though remains to be seen. For their core mechanics they get Oath of Moment, and then their Deathwing and Ravenwing themes within the codex, various units gaining those keywords which can have relevance in a few detachments. As mentioned in the update, Lionel Johnson got buffed in multiple meaningful ways, getting tougher against heavy shooting, return to reserves, and a big melee boost. And then the Dark Angels got a new detachment, the Wrath of the Rock, making their infantry and bikers harder to take down with high strength weapons, and some pretty powerful punchy stratagems. It seems to have had enough interest that a lot of people are trying it out at the very least. As mentioned though, it doesn't initially seem to be sweeping tournaments or anything like that. Otherwise, beyond that, Stormlance and Gladius have typically been the mainstays of the chapter recently. Stormlance helps out their biker style units, but in particular their melee elites as well, who really enjoy the advance and charge with Inner Circle companions, the Lion or Deathwing Knights. And Gladius can also provide advance and charge too, and has a few more general purpose things, including reactive moves and the Lance and AP stratagem. For more standout unique units, Dark Angels maybe tend to be a little bit on the limited side out of their codex. Their fighting melee elites in the Inner Circle companions and the Deathwing Knights are some of the most interesting. Big hitting damage dealers, with the Deathwing Knights also being great at taking a punch as well. Asriel's basically auto include with his good buffs for his unit and farming command points. And with the changes, I feel like Lionel Johnson went from playable to just outright strong and an asset to the faction. Some people have also been using Samael with Outriders or Black Knights or Ravenwing command squads, and certainly more so for the few people trying out Company of Hunters, which previously was seeming like the most successful unique detachment. At first impressions, I'd guess they haven't gained enormous strength from this, despite a fun new detachment, and the line certainly getting stronger. Hopefully the Wrath of the Rock does actually add some actual strength to the faction, though if it remains to be another one that just isn't quite as strong as Gladius and Stormlance, it might not significantly add to the faction's power level. I guess we'll see on that front. Either way, it would be really nice if eventually one of the Dark Angels' unique detachments actually winds up being the one to choose over the generic detachments, and otherwise in their army, most of their other character data sheets just aren't really all that great for the points cost. Either points cuts or rules changes would probably be appropriate there. Next up, we've got some more Knightly Space Marines with the Grey Knights of Titan. Pre-updates, their tournament win rates were fairly well balanced at around 50%, fighting with their squads of elite infantry with 2+ armor saves, some close range shooting and some force weapons in melee, and most people using their Warpbane task force, the sort of Purifier themed one, where you get big damage rerolls within their zones of control, though it often added up to people running loads and loads of Dread Knights, as they can make great use of that. With their balance changes, they got a cheaper Brotherhood champion, 10 strong squads of Terminators got a touch cheaper, and the Warpbane task force rerolls aren't lost if you can't see a melee target if you're fighting through a ruined wall, though none of that really feels like it's going to add to faction strength in any big way. For strong units at the moment, most armies are running 4+ Dread Knights, usually with a Grandmaster and 3 others, sometimes even more, and otherwise the more typical includes Drago and Terminators are nice, Purify squads are nice for their aura and stratagem support in Warpbane task force, and then most army lists tend to take some strike squads and interceptors for utility, sticky objectives and fast moving. Overall, from a win rate point of view, they seem pretty well balanced. I've been fairly stuck to the 50% sort of level for a while. With a few more powerful factions entering the fray, I wouldn't be too surprised if that dropped down a bit though. It does seem that sentiment around them doesn't really seem too optimistic for them succeeding on the grand tournament scene at the moment. Teleporting tricks often meaning that the army can score high, but might struggle to actually take and hold the primary, and potentially Imperial and Chaos Knights having a load more focus might not be great news for them either, as they can struggle to handle tough stuff outside of the Dread Knights. It won't be too long before they get their new codex though, and that should give them some different ways to play and some more options. Next up, we've got the Chaos Space Marines. Pre-updates, they were winning around about 47% of games, so maybe a touch on the lower side as 40k went, and they didn't really seem to be winning quite so many grand tournaments as some have been in the past. They got quite a lot of boosts in the update though. Vashtor the Archithane in particular got a whole bunch of interesting changes, and he's looking very efficient for 175 points now, and the Lord Discordant got a massive datasheet glow up, also looking far more tempting, though still perhaps a bit of a skewed model depending on whether or not you're fighting against vehicles. Beyond that, the Demon Prince gained loan up, a few characters got points cuts, and they had the Cabal of Chaos detachment with the new Sorcerer focused one. Though just at first impressions, that one really doesn't look like it's going to add any strength to the faction, more a sort of fun and fluff one if you wanted to try it. For their core mechanics, they make use of their good Dark Pacts for some chance to deal damage to your own units, to gain some unnatural damage buffs, sustained or lethal hits whenever you shoot or fight potentially, and maybe adds itself to the theme of the elite army that often wants to play aggressively to make use of those good boosts. For detachments, the Renegade Raiders and the Creations of Bile tend to be the most popular, Creations of Bile focusing on Infantry Rush Chaos Marines, with some nice augmented stat lines for things like Possessed and Chosen, and Renegade Raiders being a bit more general purpose, with some assault keywords and AP support that can help at range and melee. After several balance updates, the majority of the Chaos Space Marine units are at least fairly usable. Chosen and Legionaries with Lords in Rhinos can be a staple, sometimes Fabius Bile might want to join some Chosen. Cultists are fairly auto-include for some sticky objectives. They usually want some kind of fire support between Predators and Vindicators or some others. Cypher tends to be popular as a useful lone operative. Abaddon the Despoiler is usable, and plenty of options for fast-moving skirmish units. Things like Bikers, Raptors and Warp Talons are all nice enough, and there's plenty more beyond that. Overall, looks like they'll probably be doing fine enough. I just perhaps feel like a fair few of the points changes aren't going to impact faction strength in a big way. Probably the biggest hopes for actually making them stronger post-update to be Vashtor and the Lord Discordant. So maybe depending on whether or not they're going to become competitive staples for a lot of armies going forward, I certainly feel like they'll see some play. For army challenges and criticisms, I think it would be quite nice to see a bit more help for their struggling detachments, particularly as their identity is quite good for the various Chaos Legions out there. Things like Felhammer Siege Host, the Deceptors, or the Dread Talons could all do with a bit of help and support. Feels like that maybe should have been more of a priority versus creating new detachments based around sorcerers and stuff. Next up, we've got the Drukhari. Pre-updates, their tournament win rates have been fairly well balanced, around about 49%, though a slightly lesser played faction, with their playstyle usually being fast-moving units either in or out of transports, farming enemy pain and misery and then plugging it into big boosted shooting and melee damage, and the detachments they've been most commonly using were the Reaper's Wager, the in theory allied Harlequins one, but just gives a whole load of useful buffs towards units making their way towards melee and hitting hard when they get there, and the Sky Splinter Assault, the transport-focused one with units jumping out of transports and hitting stuff hard. For the latest balance updates, they got some really quite nice changes. Lots of staple units went down in cheaper Mandrakes, Raiders and Venoms. That'll add a few more points worth of leeway or upgrades to a few lists, and might tempt a few more people into playing Ravagers maybe. And then on top of that, there was a very direct damage boost to their best attachment, the Reaper's Wager getting reroll 1s to hits just permanently, and going up to full rerolls if your side is happening to lose the wager. I feel like maybe that's the better gain of strength there. Just a nice easy boost to efficiency for their best detachment, and some staples going down seems nice. The vast majority of their index is really quite usable at this point. Cabalites and Venoms are nice to score, Mandrakes to screen the midboard and fade away around doing secondary objectives, Beastmasters to rush out, scout and screen. Scourges can inflict painful firepower without being shot back, Incubi and Archons can hit hard out of Raiders or Venoms, and so can Lilith with some Witches. At least a single Kronos is pretty well worth having to farm some pain, and Talos are solid enough just on their datasheet strength. Most of the stuff beyond that is still absolutely fine though. For any criticisms, it maybe does feel a bit odd for them to have their strongest form in their allied detachment, and maybe weirder when they're using that allied attachment to not take any allies in it or take very few. It seems they're being left till one of the last armies of 10th edition at this point, and they're still waiting for a refresh for a whole bunch of their kits. Fingers crossed Games Workshop can deliver with a good release for them towards the end of the edition. Next up, we've got the Forces of the Greater Good. Pre-update, they were having difficulties being one of the lowest win rate armies in Warhammer 40k. Win rates are around about 44% and very little success on the top tables of grand tournaments. Part of the issue might have been their For the Greater Good mechanic, having to spot units with other units in the army list and usually commit multiple units towards amping up firepower to any one target just to be efficient. And the rest of their army tends to have a range theme with some good mobility, with fly keyword battlesuits and grav tanks going all over the place. The last balance update had a pretty meaningful impact for them though. The army rule was changed so that now one unit can basically spot for many, so one unit of stealth suits can give you reroll 1s to hit and wound, basically army-wide if you wanted to focus down one target, and at the same time they removed that split fire penalty so that it's a bit less useless to be having your secondary weapons fire at different targets now. There were some trade-offs at the same time though. Stealth suits went up to cost 80 points rather than 60, which was quite big. Carry-on was nerfed, so that now it's ignore modifiers for their bonus boost as opposed to sustained hits too. And the Pathfinder rule was changed around a bit, they're now sort of basically self-guide pretty much, to make their own firepower a little bit more dangerous when they're running around guiding things. For detachments and power-wise, Carry-On have been doing the best in the previous few weeks before the balance update, but as ever with town detachments there have been some draw to basically all of them. In the initial weekend post-update it looked like the Carry-On and Montcar were the ones that people had gravitated towards the most, so it certainly doesn't seem like that detachment's dead or anything though. Otherwise for tower units still seems that most stuff will be solidly playable. Stealth suits certainly aren't going to go away with their big marking things affecting more units now. Crisis suit combos with commanders to lead them are staples in most detachments, either some or lots depending on what you're playing. Devilfish with breaches in them are nice in Montcar and Carry-On to take the mid-board and hit things hard. The Skyrays and Hammerheads and Broadsides are nice to take down enemy heavies. Ghost Kill's nice for firepower that are safe, and Riptide's good for fairly general purpose threats that can fall back and shoot and don't mind being on the front line so much. Crutox Rampagers have lots of stats for the points and can be alright countercharge units, better in the Auxiliary Cadre or Crude Hunting Pack, as are Carnivores. Crude Carnivores can be reasonable in most lists though, just for some sticky objectives. Lots of lists take a small squad of 5 Vespid as well for a bit of return to reserves utility, jumping around the board doing secondaries as needed. Overall really quite a lot of options in the codex solely playable for their own roles. Certainly feels like after the updates Tower going to rise up, maybe the question is just how much. My guess is that there'll be a solid mid-tier army after the changes as opposed to enormously standout, though I guess we'll wait and see on that front. The firepower certainly got a lot easier to use and more efficient, though it did go alongside a few counteracting nerfs, and average tower players did seem to be struggling more before. Next up we've got the Imperial Guard, and the Astra Militarum had a 46% win rate pre-update. They often tend to be one of the factions where top players tended to be able to take them further than the average, more so than most other armies out there, and certainly seem to be common enough to see them winning grand tournaments or going undefeated runs. Their core army mechanics are the orders, to give your units extra shooting, survivability or movement, and most people tended to play either with Combined Regiment for the nice lethal hits, reinforcements and some fields of fire AP, or Hammer of the Emperor, which is quite good to support the tanks, and maybe Tauroxes, making them move faster and having plenty of supporting stratagems to help them keep firing and lining up shots on their targets. For their balance changes, they maybe feel like they came off surprisingly harshly. Some top guard lists were certainly nerfed a bit. Tauroxes went up 10, as did Leon Ross battle tanks. Ursula Creed went up a big 20 points, and 20 strong units of Creed went up by perhaps a surprising amount to 145 points. They did have a few cheaper units though. Bulgrin, Tempestus Aquilons and Death Riders all dropped a little, though maybe going from units that just weren't played very much to being a little bit more usable. And Lord Solar Leontus can order Titanic units again, which I think is a feels good change, but probably isn't going to add any strength to top lists, as most lists still wouldn't be taking them. Certainly good to see them more viable for casual play though. For stronger units, I'm sure the Rogel Dawn tank commanders will still see plenty of play. They're just very efficient and intimidating for the sheer stats that they can put out, plus being a synergy unit for orders to other vehicles out there, supported by Ross variants as before, maybe some Hellhounds to help strip cover as well. Catacomb and transports are still going to be top tier, though I feel like a few more people might be tempted by Chimeras now that they're so much closer in points cost to the Tauroxes once again. Scout Sentinels are really efficient for skirmishing and buffs. Cadians and Cadian command squads can be nice to sticky objectives and broadcast orders around the board, maybe still with Creed. Castellans can put some nice OC in the mid-board, and Gaunt's Ghosts can be returning to reserve and being a nice force to do secondary objectives and a bit of skirmishing with lighter infantry. Still feels like the Guard have got lots of good options to fall back on, but it certainly took some direct nerfs to some previous top builds. There's still plenty of data sheets that look overcosted, and I'm not convinced that's going to be enough to really make the Death Riders good. Feels like they could use the Scout keyword or something. Overall, I'd guess that Guard might not move too much from where they are. Probably win rates around about this same sort of level. They're still probably having good players being able to take them to the top on a good day. Next up, we've got the Forces of the Adeptus Astartes. Pre-update, Space Marines had win rates of around about 47%, though again we're an army that tended to overperform with tournament wins, particularly with Ultramarines with Calgar, Guilliman, or both. Perhaps Ultramarines having the usual issue of balance versus the other chapters. For their core mechanic, they get the boosted Oath of Moment, reroll hits, and also a +1 to wounds to absolutely wreck one given target each turn, and then an absolute vast amount of units in power armor, being able to field all sorts of small squads with good special rules to work together to deliver victory. For the last balance updates, they did make some changes to Ultramarines. Both Guilliman and Calgar got cheaper, but they had downsides too. Guilliman only gives you 1 free stratagem per battle round, not 2 anymore, and Calgar can't generate command points if he's the Warlord, so you're not going to want to double him up with Guilliman anymore. Otherwise, they had some small points cuts to Hellblasters, Aggressors, Vanguard Veterans, and Heavy Intercessors, and the Jump Captain. I say most of those not being crazy standouts, but not bad units, maybe feeling like more options as opposed to adding direct strength. For detachments, still feels like Gladius is going to be the single strongest. Nice turns, advance and shooter, advance and charge, reactive moves, and some good damage dealer stratagems. Vanguard and Ironstorm being the other popular ones beyond that. Some sneaky Space Marine tricks, or focus on tank and vehicle spam with some rerolls and supporting stratagems for vehicles. I still guess that most lists are either going to have Guilliman or Calgar at their helm. Calgar became more efficient and didn't get worse provided you're not using Guilliman, and Guilliman I feel had a pretty reasonable trade-off for fewer stratagems flying around for a cheaper points cost, and still that double boosted Oath of Moment is enormous, and free stratagems on things that can't normally get them. Where utility units, things like Scouts, Infiltrators, Intercessors, Incursors and Jump Intercessors are all excellent in small numbers. They can work together to deliver a lot of objectives and skirmish with the enemy well. A lot of the mainstay and heavy lifting often tends to come from tanks and dreadnoughts. Perhaps the Ballistas and Vindicator being particularly enjoyed recently, though plenty of other big scary gun tanks are all very viable. Most lists tend to include a combi weapon lieutenant for frustration and lone operative utility. Gladius lists often seem to have got into the habit of taking a lone Gravis captain with a Feel No Pain and Armor Indomitus, though exact damage combo units might vary a bit depending on the exact detachment being used and maybe the chapter being played if you're using something else like say Raven Guard with Kavan Shrike and a bunch of Jump Intercessors or Van Vets. Overall versus the rest of factions, Space Marines in general still don't seem like they're going to be in the worst place in the world. I still guess they're going to have their own internal balance problems with Ultramarines versus other chapters. I'm not sure that's going to be majorly less after this update here. It seems that something major could be on the way for Space Marines with a bunch of core codex chapters getting either releases or changes, so I guess we'll see what Games Workshop has for them later in the year. Next up, we've got the Adepta Sororitas. The Sisters of Battle were perhaps surprisingly big winners of the last update. Pre-update, their tournament stats really hadn't been doing too badly. 48% wins overall with a few top player placings, though it did maybe have a feel of just a few good players keeping the faction alive, most of them using character heavy lists with Hallowed Martyrs, having more than Val with some Paragon suits, some Castigators, Sacrosants and Sisters and Immolators. Their core mechanics get them the Miracle Dice, which decreased in number in the December balance changes, I think it was. A very powerful mechanic, though a bit random as to whether or not you can get some 6s on the board. They get their 6+ invulnerable saves, and lots of their units have power armor but tend to be fragile for the points cost, jumping out and hitting you with close range shooting or melee, but being quite weak to return fire. The last balance changes that they got were pretty enormous, just a wide-ranging list of units that went down in cost, including most of the things I would have considered staples for them already. The Castigator, Immolator, Paragon Warsuits and Seraphim all went down, as did others. The Champions of Faith went from a pretty underwhelming detachment due to having to burn all the Miracle Dice to get the best use out of it, to now being a genuine contender, given that you can make units your buffed ones without having to spend Miracle Dice to do so. and there were a few other rules rewrites as well, Retributors becoming a lot more of a viable option, and Zephyrim hitting harder on the charge, again without taxing Miracle Dice. I still guess that most people might be playing Hallowed Martyrs, that maybe Champions of Faith might have a chance of rising up to challenge them. It does help out some very good units in the Celestian Sacrosants and the Paragon suits. Feels like they do have really quite a lot of interesting options now. I wouldn't be surprised to see a few more Seraphim in lists after they went down further. I'm sure Hallowed Martyrs will still be keeping character-heavy lists on the table with the chance to get them up after death, with lots of fighting Palatines and Canonesses, maybe run solo. Still doesn't feel like they're going to be a particularly easy army to play. Fragile units reliant on trading carefully and making the most out of a limited pool of good Miracle Dice. But nice to see them looking as a far more scary faction on the board. I might have been tempted to rate them towards the top end of this Tier 2 section as opposed to the lower end. Next up, we've got the Aeldari, certainly one of the most nerfed units after the latest balance update. Pre-update, they had win rates of 53% overall, but that was being carried in a long way by Inari. They were getting win rates of around about 60% or more, plus winning a pretty crazy amount of events, mainly due to things like Lethal Intent allowing them to move out of sequence. In general, the Eldar have often been playing with Footdar style lists recently. Small squads of Aspect Warriors hitting the enemy very hard, boosted by their battle-focused movement tricks, that adding into overall profiles that are already good for speed, tending to be very dangerous but also really quite fragile. The balance changes they had though hit them hard in a lot of different ways. Inari got hit on multiple fronts, Lethal Intent got nerfed in a big way, if Rain no longer gives as good rerolls in melee, and several units went up as well, the Incarn, Inari Archons and Incubi. On top of that, a lot of the useful small units of Aspects went up, Fire Dragons 120 for the small squad, Howling Banshees went up, as did the Autarch, and even the Seer Council caught some flack as well from Warlocks going up. They did have a few things to go the other way. The Fire Prism, War Walker and Shining Spears all went down a bit, though all those were units that were pretty rarely seen in strong lists. As a result of the big Inari nerf, it looks like people are going to be pivoting back to Aspect Host and Seer Council potentially. Warhost also seems to have had a bunch more people take that up again, at least from the first weekend's data. That might make sense given that that's the more obvious movement shenanigans style list if you want something to do similar to Inari. It does feel like Aeldari did have options to fall back on, but Inari certainly seem like they're far less popular. For their strong units, most of their small Aspect squads are still all very viable. Warp Spiders, Dark Reapers and Striking Scorpions tending to be staples, maybe Fire Dragons or Dark Reapers being supported by Wave Serpents. They can be nice with the stratagems to re-embark in them. Howling Banshees, Fire Dragons and Autarchs still seem absolutely fine despite the nerfs. Definitely less efficient than they used to be though. Wraith Lords are pretty strong for a bit of raw muscle and some big bright lances. Lots of lists take some Guardians for sticky objectives and cheap units of Rangers for some sacrificial units in the midboard. And a good chunk of the Phoenix Lords are interesting enough as well. Maybe Jinzar, Lycus and Fugum being interesting, and Eldrad Ulthran might look better by comparison given that he's the same cost as he was. With the changes though, certainly seems that they're going to be dropping in power a touch. I don't think it's going to be enough to make them one of the weakest factions in the game though. Maybe for weaknesses, perhaps one of the biggest ones is that Footdar lists are really quite fragile. They don't enjoy things that can hit them first from a long distance, such as indirect fire or close-range deep strikes, and the Aspect Warriors with their increased points cost are getting ever more painful to lose from things like Overwatch or anything that can catch up with them easily enough. Finally, for the lower half of this tier, we've got the Leagues of Votann. The Space Dwarves have had things at least fairly similarly for their army for quite some time now, win rates around about the 50% sort of mark. The army may be mainly focusing around at least somewhat close-range shooting, with their mechanic of judgment tokens marking a whole bunch of units that are going to be easier to destroy, giving you +1 to hit and wound, and more handed out for things that destroy your units. The last balance change didn't really do too much, just a small change to transporting the Ironmaster and Grimnirs that makes it a bit easier and more quality of life. They're not really altering things in any significant way. They only have the 2 detachments, and people play the Oathband out of those, marking more units for judgment tokens than otherwise, and some powerful and straightforward damage and defensive stratagems, things like Void Armor, the big sustained hit stratagem, falling back to shoot, and returning fire when your unit takes damage. Their army's got a fairly small roster as they wait for the new releases that will come out with their codex, but at the moment the vast majority of it is really quite playable. Usually lists take a good amount of Sagitors with a mix of Hearthkin and Berserks in them, often going quite heavy with scouty units with some big hitting anti-tank firepower, often a pair of Land Fortresses at 2,000 points, most popularly with the big conversion beam cannons. Hunkin Pioneers are nice for some autocannon scouting. A single unit of Jaegers tends to be the norm, to allow the Pioneers and the Sagitors to scout properly, and pretty well everything else is at least usable. Recently, people seem to be taking Grav Thunderkin a fair bit more over Einhir Hearthguard. The latter perhaps didn't do so great out of the Void Armor change. Without any major changes, seems likely that there will be a pretty solid army in the mid-tier of 40k still. Perhaps for weaknesses, most people tend to just talk about them as a fairly straightforward damage and defense 40k army without too many sneaky tricks. The unit pool is a bit limited as well, so not really very much variety or surprises to bring in lists. Fingers crossed the Codex can help with that, and it does look like they've had a particularly good first few games in the new balance update, winning a couple of events and getting high win rates on the first weekend. I guess they probably will just go back towards the default where they were before though, and fairly well balanced and mid-tier. Moving onwards though, let's talk about some armies that had ranked perhaps towards the upper end of tier 2. Perhaps factions that I feel like are a little bit more likely to punch up towards the top tables or have higher win rates. First up, I've chosen to put the Tyranids here. Like the leagues of Votann, they seem to have been very well balanced and around about the 50% win rate mark for a very long time. Some people winning at tournaments. They're not in a particularly standout way relative to other factions, and they have their core mechanics with the Shadow and the Warp allowing them to trigger some whole table battle shot once per game, and their Synapse buff giving you leadership and strength to nearby swarms. The last balance update had quite a few changes for them, maybe one of the single biggest being the new Subterranean Assault detachment, that one allowing your Trigons, Morlocks and Raveners to put down tunnel markers and have some interesting options for returning things to reserve and moving them around the table. Plus also getting 6-inch deep strikes and a casual reroll ones to hit on literally everything aren't bad things at all. As well as that, a few datasheets got cheaper. Tyrants got cheaper, but they have fewer free stratagems going around than they used to. They still seem good. The Psychophage got a rewrite that maybe feels more like a side grade than an upgrade to me at first impressions, and they got access to their new Ravener datasheets for the ones coming out in Kill Team Typhon. The hyper-adaptive Raveners do feel like a pretty scary general purpose threat with those anti-keywords, and look rather nice in Vanguard Onslaught being a very threatening unit worth of Vanguard Invaders. For detachments, previously Invasion Fleet was the most popular, and it's still one of the easiest to use with big damage buffs and feel no pain stratagems. Otherwise, Vanguard Onslaught, Assimilation Swarm and Crusher Stampede were all doing well enough. It does initially look like Subterranean Assault is very much going to be entered in with the rest of those though. Just having an army-wide damage buff and easy 6-inch charges for certain units is a pretty massive big deal, and it looks like plenty of people have chosen to play it. For standout units, a lot of Tyranid lists tend to build around their big heavy hitter bugs. Exocrines, Maleceptors, Norn Emissaries and Tyrannifexes tend to be staples, some of the better units out there for taking down enemy heavies with toughness 10 or higher. Most lists tend to include a Hive Tyrant, and I don't think that will change. They've got plenty of options for lone operative Lictors. The standard Lictor with its rapid ingress for free is very nice. The Neurolictor for battle shock synergies is good, and it's pretty handy to have one Biovore in the backfield to score by throwing around Spore Mines. Broodlords and Genestealers are very nasty, maybe particularly so in Vanguard Onslaught. Assimilation Swarm has some synergy with their own keyworded units. As mentioned, I feel like those hyper-adaptive Raveners look like a solid enough unit that could be quite tempting. For faction issues, they're still likely to have problems with the toughest armour around, and I still feel like there's some datasheets like the Toxicrine and a few detachments that lag behind the rest, though I feel like for overall unit and detachment balance they're doing better than some. Seems like a pretty reasonable time to be playing Tyranids. Next up, we've got the Genestealer Cults. Pre-update, their win rates were also around about 50% for the Tyranid cultist allies, rising up from below with their guerrilla warfare tactics, having most of their army deep strike, and having their interesting second wave of troops with their cult ambush. Resurgence points allowing you to return a bunch of recently slain units into reserve. The last balance changes were also quite light touch. Jackals got a tiny bit cheaper, down to 75 points, and both Pure Strains and Jackals in squads of 5 only cost 2 resurgence points to put back on the board. That's a pretty big win for both of those units as well. I feel like the Pure Strains in particular do well with that, with small nuisance units that could come back straight away. If they're infiltrating, there may be more odds on to be killed early than some. They could also use the new Ravener datasheets in Final Day if desired. For their detachment choices, they seem to be another army that's pretty well balanced, with multiple ones finding success. Biosanctic Brood Surge with its focus around Genestealers, Aberrants, and Biophagus-led units. The Patriarch does well in that with the enhancement that it can get. There's the Host of Ascension, maybe biggest around big blocks of neophytes with shooting combos, maybe with a Benefactus or Primus. And the Final Day is the sort of Tyranid allied one, allowing you access to the Vanguard Invader datasheets, being particularly useful for things like their lone operatives such as Lictors. Those don't really seem like they're going to change in a big way, unless Jackals somehow make people play Outlander Claw a lot more. Otherwise, just for generically strong units, it's rare to see a list without Achilles Rigged Runners given those really easy AP buffs. Both flavours of Acolytes are good just for skirmishing and fighting in the first place, and nice to have at least one unit of them and some neophytes for the things they can do with objectives. Usually it's worth having a couple of the good lone operatives that they have on offer as well, maybe the Reductus Saboteur being fairly standout. Overall, they felt like they were in a pretty good place before with multiple viable playstyles. That still looks like it's going to be the case. though still look that they'll be an army that's maybe harder to play than the average one in 40k. Lots of fragile units that really have to weigh up getting the alpha strike and making sure they hit hard while doing so. With lots of options and shenanigans, they're going to be an army that rewards a top player more than an average one. Next up, we've got the Space Wolves, which have sort of provisionally put around about this area. Currently, they're sort of awkwardly in Index Codex limbo. Games Workshop has unleashed the Codex with its digital points update. They've advised that that one isn't the one to use in tournaments and events, and a lot of the models that it refers to aren't even out yet. So at the moment, you're likely to have some people playing with new Codex rules and some people with Index ones. With their Index rules, they feel like they're being fairly mid-tier for 40k and didn't get any changes in the balance update, not beyond a few small things for Space Marines. But the Codex is going to change them in quite a big way, as they maybe make this faction stronger. It is kind of early days at the moment, and I do feel like there's some big winners or losers on their units front. For Index Space Wolves, it tends to be all about the Stormlance and the Champions of Rust for the detachments. The Stormlance if you want to lean really heavily into Thunderwolves led by characters. The Champions of Rust being rather general purpose with its sagas, being able to select one at the start of the game and then hopefully unlock others, and favouring a very character-heavy build. I'll certainly be interested to see which of the new Space Wolf detachments from the Codex gets embraced the most. At first impressions, the Saga of the Beastslayer feels like a pretty easy one to use. A nice core damage buff from its special rule, plus a few rather helpful sneaky tricks on the stratagem front. The other Codex detachments definitely look like they have their own interest as well though. For Index Space Wolves, often Thunderwolves and character support tend to be a core of the army. Logan Grimnar often gets included for army-wide rerolls for a turn. Wolfen are solid enough for their stat lines even if they get no OC. Ragnar can be punchy enough leading various units, and beyond the fell-handed, it is a solid and powerful dreadnought. In the Codex, it still feels like Thunderwolves are going to be a very interesting unit, just 100 points for 3 of them with big boosted stats. They won't get the character support anymore, but they'll hit a lot better on their own steam. Both Beyond the Fell-Handed and Logan Grimnar are both looking like they might be retaining their title as some of the better characters out there. I wouldn't be too surprised to see people running Logan Grimnar on his own. And for the generic characters, maybe the Iron Priest and Battle Leader seem like some of the best. The Iron Priest seems pretty crazy, giving rapid fire to heavy-hitting las cannons like Predator Annihilators or Ballistas Dreadnoughts, and the Battle Leader has some good stats for the cost and a nice buff. Otherwise, maybe the Hammer Wolfen and the Wolfguard Headtakers seem like fairly focal units for the Codex. Maybe the Wolfguard Terminators will be strong enough to break through as well. I feel like with the detachment synergies, they're going to want at least some Space Wolf keyword melee infantry. It feels like it's probably going to be more likely one of those versus the troops at first impressions that might struggle to punch up against tougher stuff. I'm certainly looking forward to seeing what combos people tend to use the most once there's some tournament data out. Seems like it might be a bit of a waiting game until that happens for them. And there still seem to be some datasheets that leave a bit to be desired. The Grey Hunters seem to be very pricey for what they do, and aren't really too helpful being locked into big units either. Next up, we've got the Golden Guardians of the Adeptus Custodes. Pre-updates, they had tournament win rates of around about 51%, primarily using their Lines of the Emperor detachment that they gained at the last update. The Custodes certainly have their own way of playing 40k. Enormous great big tough stat lines with toughness 6, a 2+ save, and a whole bunch of 4+ invulnerables, and then general purpose melee beatdown with their Guardian Spears that are good profiles against most things in the game, further augmented with Martial Qatar for lethal or sustained hits. They tend to want to walk towards the midfield objectives and dare the enemy to come close enough to take it off them. They didn't get much changes in the update. Allo's Custodians dropped down to 60 points each. Previously they were 65 and they were already seeing some good play in Lines of the Emperor. Looks like they got far more tempting there and pretty well better elsewhere too. The Lines of the Emperor has tended to be the popular one. That's the one that gives the Custodians +1 to wound if they're not too near other Custodian units. Some nice stratagems for skirmishing in the midboard, and some good enhancements, particularly good for shield captains, and Trajan Valoris likes 2 uses out of his moment shackle here. For other detachments, the Shield Host and the Solar Spearhead seem to have been the most common and popular, both adding good value, the Solar Spearhead being all very focused on its Dreadnought units. The Codex doesn't have an enormous array of units, but pretty well most of the actual standard Custodes units are very usable right now. Wardens and Blade Champions are still very solid as a central damage dealer unit, moving fast, being tough and hitting hard. Custodian Guard with Kyria Draxus is still a great combo, stopping them getting shot at long range and then doubling up on all the shooting buffs for Kyria Draxus' shooting attacks. Virtus Praetors and Venatari Custodians are both nice on the fast attack front. As mentioned, the Allarus got better. it generally makes sense to take a few small units of Sisters of Silence to screen and score, and Caladius Grav tanks can have some big hitting anti-tank in the backfield. As ever for Custodes, they maybe tend to be a slightly predictable stat check style army, maybe a little bit more limited on the clever play options compared with some armies in the game, and that usually tends to have them better performing at a casual and RTT style level as opposed to the top tables of grand tournaments. They certainly still tend to win their share of those as well. Still feels like they're going to be a pretty solid mid-tier army, and likely still quite popular on the tournament tables as they've been before. Next up, I've chosen to put the Deathwatch here as well. There was maybe a bit borderline between ranking them here versus the next tier up. Pre-update, they've generally been doing fairly well on the tournament stats and things. Win rates are around about 52%, maybe a bit more. They're a very little played army, being very niche in their own right, though Games Workshop having discouraged people from picking them up by trying to remove them briefly. So you're not really going to get too many people jumping into the faction when their existence has been threatened so much. For their core mechanics, they get Oath of Moment, and then they're pretty well exclusively played with their Black Spear Task Force. That one gives you multiple turns worth of damage boosts from their mission tactics, and then some interesting special issue ammo stratagems to amp up the firepower of their kill teams, plus some teleport tricks. They didn't really get anything major in the latest balance update, their units staying pretty well as they were. A few generic Space Marine units had some points shifts that seem unlikely to affect the faction's strength in any way. Deathwatch mainly didn't want to use most of those units anyway, perhaps one of the most relevant being the Jump Captain that could be useful for the Talon Strike team I suppose. For putting them on the table as well as their core rules and stratagems, the Black Spears also got some great enhancements. The Thief of Secrets is excellent on a Gravis Captain or Judas here, and the Tone of Ectoclades can give you some multiple uses of Oath of Moment to give you some big rerolls, and then that damage buff might be applied to some of their good kill team units. Maybe the most popular ones to put on the table are the Deathwatch veterans with their heavy Thunderhammers, often led by Watchmasters or Judases. Their Terminator kill teams deep strike in with a bunch of heavy hitting rocket shots, and most lists tend to include a good couple of units of big chunky kill teams in Gravis armor. The Indomitor ones punch extra hard with their bolt rifles, and you get a bunch of Eradicators and Aggressors included in the unit as well. Beyond that, they can take some good supporting units for the Space Marines, maybe some Intercessors for sticky objectives, Infiltrators to screen deep strike, likely a Nuisance Combi Weapon Lieutenant, maybe a Stormspeeder Thunderstrike to amp up firepower, and other units could use their Teleportarium thing as well, maybe Inceptors or Devastator Centurions if you don't think you're going to be using it on the kill teams as much. Overall, in terms of gameplay, they seem to be in a great spot. Probably the biggest issues that they have are just being in a slightly odd place in 40k in general, only surviving due to a digital update balance patch rather than a full codex, and literally having had no new models in the Primaris era that weren't generic sculpts. That certainly makes people apprehensive about getting into the faction at the moment, the fear of either being removed or all models being updated. I guess for rules issues it'd be nice for Games Workshop to make the Corvus Blackstar good, just given that it's one of their very few unique models that they can put on the tabletop. Finally, for armies that have ranked at this tier, we have the World Eaters. They're a codex that maybe weren't the best received when they came out. They seem to be doing absolutely fine for tournament performance. Win rates are around about 48%, and they have been doing at least fairly well at breaking into top tables and getting some high placings. Maybe not quite as crazily stand out as some of their Chaos Brothers have done for the actual victories of tournaments though. Their core rules are all about melee fighting, getting the Blessings of Khorne for various damage buffs and a few other close combat shenanigans. And for the balance update they didn't really get anything significant, a few FAQs more relating to their recent codex, which is the real update that they had recently. With options from their codex, they're mainly using the Berserker Warband. That's nice and general purpose with big melee damage buffs, and a strength buff in particular makes Berserkers go from being rather underwhelming to fairly scary with a bunch of strength 6 attacks on the charge. The good numbers are also using Khorne Demonkin as well, the allied demon detachment where you've got a few really good options there. That crazy powerful stratagem to allow Bloodletters to turn up and get very close charges, and the option of putting a Juggernaut Lord in a bunch of Blood Crushers is pretty murderous as well, as he can give them the Blessings of Khorne, and that was confirmed in the latest FAQ for them. Otherwise, for stronger units in general, Berserkers in a Rhino with Kharn the Betrayer is a pretty solid combo. Kharn goes a long way to make them from being a sort of medium threat into a genuinely big threat with his own damage profile and rerolls. Most armies tend to take a few small squads of 8 bound, often just 3 of them, perhaps with a Slaughterbound leading them for a rather murderous scout threat that can jump on the enemy and hit them really hard with blessings and stratagem buffs. They've got a few good options for good skirmish infantry. One unit of Jackals is usually taken for sticky objectives, otherwise multiple units of Spawn tend to be good, very expendable, surprisingly hard hitting, and can charge an enormously long way. The Foot Demon Prince often tends to be at the heart of a lot of lists, handing out free stratagems and maybe having enhancements like the Helm of Brazen Ire, and a few of their mechanised units are pretty standout as well. Forge Fiends in particular, with their brutal close-range, rapid-fire ectoplasma shooting, and the Hellbrute is utterly murderous as well, with the option for those repeated activations. If they can get into the enemy army without getting shot down first, they're going to make an absolutely enormous mess against basically everything. Overall, they're currently feeling like a solid mid-tier faction for 40k at the moment, with the option to be able to punch up. Maybe the single biggest complaint and criticism might be Angron at the moment, who is notably weak for the faction, which isn't a great feel. Let's move on though to some of the armies that feel like they're perhaps some of the scarier ones out there, and tier 1 I've chosen to rank these guys as some of the top. Here I've placed Chaos Demons, Blood Angels, Necrons, Thousand Sons, Emperor's Children, and Chaos Knights. I feel like at the moment these ones look like they're in a place where they're going to win more games and tournaments versus most 40k factions out there, lots of them having some pretty seriously powerful options. At the absolute top of this tier though, I've chosen to rank 2 further armies in a sort of S tier, perhaps feeling that they're going to be holding the crown for some of the scariest armies in the game going forward. First up, we've got the Chaos Knights, which I'd guess are going to be towards this upper end of Warhammer 40k power spectrum, based on their codex and their datasheet costs. They're one of the ones that I'm less sure about at the moment though. They haven't hit tournaments at time of recording, but just from their initial stats and points cost, it does seem like they're going to be really quite a strong and a force to be reckoned with. As ever, the Chaos Knights are a big army worth of big stompy walkers. The Titanic ones can move over models and smash their way through terrain. And in the new codex, they've changed around their dread abilities a bit and get progressive auras of them that go on throughout the battle. They do have a really useful one in a -1 to hit at greater than 18 inches away, which should help take the edge off gun lines against them. The codex changes really show up the army in quite a big way. Some of the Wardogs got a little worse, the Carnivores looking rather excellent still, and the Stalker gained Scout, which is helpful. The Big Knights got enormous points drops, and they've added in 4 new detachments, all of which look like they had some genuinely good strength. Traitorous Lance with the balanced stratagems that we know and walk through walls for Wardogs. If you want to build around the dread abilities, then that seems to be the one to go for. Infernal Lance that adds a whole bunch of raw power, that's the one that gets Diabolic Bulwark, and being able to flex a nice easy damage speed or defense buffs feels like that one's going to be a seriously easy one to get good value out of. The big Lords of Dread one has a godly sticky objective one, and lots of good stuff for the Titanics. And then there's the Wardog Pack one, which has some very nice stratagems for carrying them as the heart of the army. For the datasheets beyond the Wardogs mentioned, it feels like maybe the Abhorrent chassis are going to be the most interesting. The Abominant at 325 points is looking pretty seriously valuable for just how aggressive you can be with those now. And the Rampager, Despoiler and Desecrator all at 335 add a lot of value in their own way. I feel like maybe the dual Gatling Despoiler with lethal hits and the Infernal detachment just looks like a knight that's going to murderize basically everything. The Forge World updates are also looking rather good for them. A Knight Lancer all the way down to 355 points feels pretty immense. And between all that, it certainly looks like the big guys are back on the table. Still kind of remains to be seen exactly how well this will all translate into actual tournament performance. From first impressions, I'd guess they're probably going to be on the upper end of the power spectrum. I do wonder if in the light of the recent Imperial Knights points drops though, they might suffer in comparison to those. They do seem to have kind of similar sort of numbers, but directly more powerful datasheets due to their supporting rules. As ever with big knight armies as well, I suspect that the Imperial and Chaos ones won't be quite so standout at an absolute top of Grand Tournament level, and doing better in RTTs and casual play versus that, just due to being a slightly more simplistic stat check style army with a little bit less scope for clever play. Next up, and following on in a very chaos-heavy top couple of tiers, we have the Celestial Legion of the Emperor's Children. They've been doing very well in terms of power levels since their Codex release. Win rates are around about 54%, and a fair amount of Grand Tournament victories to go alongside that. In particular, the single biggest tournament after the Balanced Data Slate has already been won by them, very much showing that they've still got it to compete at the absolute highest levels, and they're doing fine elsewhere as well. Their core Thrill Seekers mechanic can allow them to advance shoot and charge and fall back shoot and charge, provided you're not doubling up with other units or re-attacking the same thing. They get generally fast movement stats along with their Slaneshi natures. They're often going to be able to strike the enemy first, but maybe not be quite so durable on the hit back. For the detachments, the big damage one in the Coterie of the Conceited still seems to be the most dominant by far, making pledges and then delivering on those. Bring down units for Glory of the Prince of Pleasure, and a fair few good supporting stratagems and enhancements for Demon Princes too. Otherwise, Peerless Bladesman seems to be the next most common. The Emperor's Children don't have a vast amount of units, and it doesn't look like builds for them have changed in a crazy way since the balance changes. Winged Princes, Noise Marines and Lucius all went up, though they all seem to be absolutely viable in strong armies. Winged Princes hit hard with their big amount of mortal wounds, Lucius is a really efficient lone operative, and Noise Marines provide the range support of the list with nice general purpose firepower that really lights the coterie buffs. Besides them, there tend to be a good number of the troops on the board, infractors with the Lord Exultant, maybe a couple of units of Tormentors for infiltrating and sticky objectives, often a single Lord Cacophonist, and maybe more Fiends and the on-foot Demon Prince might break through a little bit more in the face of the Wing Princes going up a touch. Overall, they definitely took some nerfs and don't really have all that many units to fall back on. They're certainly a touch less powerful versus pre-update. They still look like they're going to be one of the stronger armies in the game. It would perhaps be nicer to see Fulgrim and Flawless Blades a little bit more viable though. Next up, and for our next flavour of Scary Chaos Army, we've got the Thousand Suns. They've also had their new codex go live just a little bit after the Death Guard and World Eaters. Very little tournament data out for them yet, though they have had one weekend. I think they got a 56% wins there, and lots of people playing them with multiple event wins, so all looking rather positive so far, but very early days on those sort of stats yet. For their core mechanics, they generally operate with their Rubric Marines buffed by sorcerers, their psychers using Kabbalistic rituals to cast their powers, and are often going to be aiming to manage risk and striving to cast the boosted form of their Kabbalistic rituals, as when they go off on those big numbers, they tend to be really quite powerful, say AP2 buffs, full rerolls to hit, Doom Bolt, or moving an extra 6 inches. Compared with their index version, the codex does seem to have added a good amount of variety, multiple detachments viable, most people still focusing on the already magical damage orientated Grand Coven, Magnus often being a popular choice in that, though Rubric Phalanx has had some success as well with Scarab Occult Terminators, led by a Terminator Sorcerer in there for lethal hits and a +1 to hit with the enhancement and some good stratagem support, and Warp Meld Pact for the mutant units, allowing you some damage for some +1s or -1s to wound, and really being quite good for board control and supporting the efficient Enlightened datasheets. The majority of the units in the codex are pretty viable to some extent. Most lists include Mutalith Vortex Beasts, both with a bunch of raw power plus bonuses to cast. Zangor Enlightened with Great Bows are one of the strongest and most auto-include units, a unit that can operate as a fast skirmish squad but also has the damage output of a damage dealer, particularly when buffed with Kabbalistic rituals. Rubric Marines led by sorcerers or infernal masters and jumping out of rhinos should be able to delete the vast majority of things on the mid-board objectives, maybe taking Inferno Bolters in Rubric Phalanx. They've got lots of good options to cover various flavours of cheap skirmishers, Zangors, Spawn, Enlightened, and maybe a unit of Secatars for the infiltrate role. Magnus is solid in Grand Coven, Demon Princes are viable, and the Predator Annihilator has seen some play as an easy-to-use gun turret, getting 4 rerolls to hit against something that you've shot with a Psychic spell that turn. Overall, nice to see multiple units and detachments having plenty of interest on the tabletop. I think they're still going to be an army that's a bit more cerebral and requiring more thought than some, managing risk of casting psychic powers, and some very big options that you could deploy in different ways on your army, and it is going to have big impacts on the game as to what you choose. In general, though, they're looking like they're in a very good spot, both very strong and a lot of sorcerer's goodness viable. Next up, we've got the Necrons, who did surprisingly well out of the last update. Pre-update, they had around 52% wins, so on the upper end of the 40k power scale, and also winning lots of grand tournaments alongside that, and given that context they maybe did surprisingly well out of the latest update. That one did have a bit of give and take. The Scorpet Lord and the Feel No Pain enhancement for Awakened both got worse, and Locust Destroyers individually got pricier, though it was kind of surprising that they made the Canoptet Wraiths and Technomancer cheaper, given that they were really quite common already, and also Deathmarks, Illuminor Zeraz, the Doomstalker and Plasmancer all went down, and all of those were at least usable previously. For stronger detachments at the moment, most Necron players seem to be deciding between either Starshatter Arsenal or Awakened Dynasty. Starshatter giving you the big damage boosts against objectives, some powerful stratagems and good support for things like the Silent King and Doomsday arcs, both of which are good datasheets. Awakened Dynasty is the one that's focused around leader and character combos, boosted damage for led units and then some seriously powerful stratagems. Fairly nice for Technomancer Wraiths, Scorpet Lords plus Destroyers and Troops combos. Beyond those, having a Katana or two can be a really strong central centerpiece, and could be a good choice for supporting with a Reanimator for reanimating some seriously durable wounds. They've got plenty of solid options for cheap interference or secondary units, things like Flayed Ones, Ophidian Destroyers, those Death Marks and more. Hex Marks could also be useful, partly to bear enhancements too. Imitate the Stormlord can farm some command points. As mentioned, Doomsday Arcs can provide some serious heavy firepower, and better in Starshatter. Overall still feels like they're in for a pretty good time, being in a solid position already and then one of their best combo units getting significantly better. Still feels like they'll be running in contention and winning plenty of tournaments. Next up we've got the Blood Angels, who I feel like have to be the single most improved faction post-update. Their win rates have been dropping off a bit over the run of the previous update, around about 46% or so, and few Grand Tournament win placings. They get the Space Marine Oath of Moment damage boost, and then generally big hitting jump infantry squads tend to be the order of the day, with easy access to advance and charge, and big buffs to strength and attacks from the Liberator Assault group. For their last update, they got perhaps a surprising amount of points cuts. I was expecting a few nudges to push them back towards the midfield, but it felt like Games Workshop went far above that. Sanguinary Guard dropping down to 110 points for 3 is kind of mad. They're already a pretty strong unit at 130 in my opinion, and the big squads also went down, though not by quite as much. The Jump Death Company and their support characters also dropped. The Jump Captain went down for the standard Space Marines, which will be relevant for Sanguinary Guard as well. The Battle Predator and Death Company Dreadnought got a bit more playable. Vanguard Veterans are cheaper to the point where they could be an alternative units to have more of alongside Jump Intercessors, and seemingly to try and give some focal help to the Death Company, Black Rage got easier to mitigate with other characters. Blood Angels armies tended to be either using Liberator Assault Group for fast moving and hard hitting damage, but plenty also going for the character focused Angelic Inheritors. They've got some very nice stratagems and also nice damage buffs, but lots to character units, so it basically means that all you want all of your central units to have leaders. For strong units now, Sanguinary Guard do seem to be the absolute main event. I can see absolutely no reason that you wouldn't run at least 3 units of 3 of them at the bare minimum, and then the choice is whether or not to build them out to 6 and add Dante or Captains in as you'd choose. The Sanguinaur and Mephiston are both really fighty lone operatives that the enemy is going to struggle to deal with. I'd probably put it back to Mephiston being the single best of the two. Now he's down to 120 points once more. Captains plus Assault Intercessors can give you some serious damage buffs, maybe jumping out of Impulsors potentially. Skirmish troops like Jump Intercessors and Vanguard Veterans are nice. Scouts are pretty good with combat blades. They can both be expendable and scrap for the midboard, and often backed up by a small amount of Space Marine firepower and utility units like Intercessors, Infiltrators, or Combi Lieutenants. Overall, between all that, they've got an enormous boost. They did admittedly come from a place where people were struggling to do that well with them. I guess they probably won't be the single top faction in Warhammer 40k, but in general, I'd say they're looking rather good. Finally, and for yet another Chaos army that seems to be punching above its weight, we've got the Chaos Demons. The Denizens of the Warp also feel like they've been doing rather well prior to the update, with tournament win rates around about 54% or so. Plenty of Grand Tournaments won, both with Demonic Incursion and Shadow Legion, and didn't really get any serious nerfs in the balance pass. They had a few not crazily impactful changes, including some small points nerfs to the good Shadow Legion enhancements, which does make them a little bit less a standout source of value, though I'd say they're both worth it. Nurglings cost more, but get a 5+ invulnerable save as a trade-off, and there were some small buffs to the Tzeentch and Khorne detachments. They're probably not enough to make them crazily meaningfully better. As ever, the demons fight with their own set of rules. Their whole army deep strikes and is reliant on invulnerable saves, not armor saves, and they have the Shadow of Chaos that can threaten to restore demons and damage mortals, potentially allowing very close deep strike and demon incursion as well. Each of the deities gets their own themes and ways to fight, which is reflected in their stat lines and profiles. I still expect Shadow Legion and Demonic Incursion being the ways to go. Shadow Legion giving further buffs to the deity legions, particularly making Nurgle and Tzeentch harder to kill, and Khorne hit harder, and you can also ally in solid Chaos Space Marine datasheets. Having Cultists available are quite nice, and they've got plenty of other adequately strong options. Otherwise, Demonic Incursion is the one for warp rifts and reserves manipulation, having close 6-inch charges that you can just jump out of the warp and throw yourselves at the enemy. Very easy to put unsuspecting enemy units in a very bad situation. For standout units, Bellicor himself is often at the helm of a bunch of lists, shielding a good portion of the army from big gun lines, and having respectable stats in his own right. Most of the Nurgle units are really quite good as utility support, cheap infiltrate from Nurglings, sticky objectives from Plague Bearers, Beasts are nice cheap annoyance scouting units, and Khorne can help out a little bit for the utility stuff, with Fleshhounds bouncing on and off the board with their special rule. Then the main damage of most lists tends to be carried by the Greater Demons, maybe the Great Unclean One and Rotagus sticking their heads out as some of the more obvious really strong ones, just enormously tanky but still fairly good damage profiles. The other named ones and the Bloodthirsters are pretty tempting as well, perhaps particularly with the Return to Reserve shenanigans that a Bloodthirster can do in the Shadow Legion with that enhancement. Most stuff is at least fairly playable. Say Screamers and Flamers are nice enough for the forces of Tzeentch as well. Overall, feels like Demons are remaining to have a very good time on the tabletop. Perhaps for challenges to the faction, there's maybe some apprehension about the plan for them after Games Workshop's decided not to give them a codex for 10th edition. Certainly feels like it could be the first step in phasing them out and then just making them Deity Legion only, even if it's not happened yet. Otherwise, for codex balance, the Deity Legion detachments aren't quite so standout, even if they might be playable, and the Slaanesh units maybe still feel like they're paying for the sins of pre-nerf Legion of Excess. I still guess both Shadow Legion and Incursion will be doing rather well going forward. Incursion maybe gaining a tiny bit on Shadow Legion due to those points changes. Finally, that just leaves us with 2, and as mentioned, just ranked a bit ahead of the previous crowd. I've chosen to put the 2 armies up here, and they are maybe the predictable ones with Death Guard and Imperial Knights. I feel like with just the sheer amount of raw power at the moment, these guys are probably going to be in an incredibly good spot. The Death Guard already proving themselves that they can win tournaments really quite well, and they had no nerfs to bring them down from that level. And then the Imperial Knights just being handed a massive win for their Titanic data sheets, getting enormous points decreases. Though as ever with them, I'd expect them to probably be more dominant at RTT and casual levels as opposed to grand tournaments, though I'm sure they certainly will win some. Starting with those knights first, both the Imperial Knights and the Death Guard already were the 2 strongest armies in terms of win rate in 40k. Imperial Knights having a 56% win rate and still managing to take down a good amount of grand tournaments. And of course, like their Chaos cousins, they are a whole army of big stompy walkers, Titanic Knights with big guns and massive melee weapons, able to walk straight through terrain, and their core mechanics giving you some big damage rerolls with Lay Low the Titans, a command point boost if you slay the Warlord, and a 6+ Feel No Pain. For the latest balance change that they got, as mentioned, their Titanic Knight profiles have dropped an enormous amount of points. I guess in theory a trade-off for the different stat lines they've got. The big knights drop down to toughness 11 but gain 4 wounds as a countermeasure. I'd say that changes a side grade, not a downgrade on individual model durability, and the points drop turns it into an enormous upgrade. The armigers do feel like they've lost a bit of power though. Similar stat line changes, but they get some objective downgrades, going down to OC6 and dropping down to 3 if they're bracketed, and also their melter weapons only having 18-inch range rather than 24 inches, both of which are at least fairly meaningful. It does feel like with those changes in that context that big knights are going to be far more common in lists. Previously people were using a lot of Canis Rex alongside a whole bunch of armigers. I feel like they're probably going to be at least 3 big knights in most army lists going forward though. Canis Rex went from auto-include to super auto-include. Previously it was 450 points and dropped down to 380 without, in my opinion, any sort of big nerf at all. And then already very strong Titanic Knights also dropped down. Lancer and Atropos for 365 points is a crazy deal for their stats and the damage they can do. The Knight Crusader at 365 points is looking like a rather brutal death machine. The Castellan at 395 is crazy given the inbuilt Lay Low the Tyrant rerolls. That thing is just ridiculous amounts of danger with its Volcano Lance. Made for the others, both the Paladin and Errant also seem interesting at 345. I'm sure that they'll still be having some armigers to support them, screening and doing grunt work, though I would guess that they'll be more in the region of maybe say like 3 to 6 of them or something, as opposed to being the mainstay of armies. It will be interesting to see how armies handle playing against knights. A few more things can interact with their profiles now, with the lower toughness characteristics, and most other armies have more of an option to play smart and use terrain effectively. And if the focus is going to be on big knights, they're not going to have all that many expendable units to run around doing mission things. I'd guess that even with these downsides though, they're probably going to be one of the stronger armies in the game. Lots more people will be playing them. It certainly seems possible their win rate could go up from the 56% that they were previously. I guess that maybe these lower points might make sense in the context of the Codex when it comes out, and perhaps reflective that knights might not get quite as much raw power from their detachment rules, though I guess that's speculation at the moment. Either way, it looks like with those points changes, knights become one of the single scariest armies in Warhammer 40k, and more so at a more casual level. Finally, we've got the Legion of Nurgle, with the Death Guard again being one of the scariest armies in the game currently. Previously it did look like they were just objectively the strongest faction in Warhammer 40k, win rates of 58% and claiming far more grand tournament victories than any other competitor, and that absolutely doesn't seem to have slowed down whatsoever after the balance update. I think they've already won something like 5 tournaments even in the first weekend, never mind whatever else they go on to do. Their core army mechanics have some big boosted toughness stats, and then their Contagions of Nurgle giving you -1 toughness and then extra boosted effects for things nearby, plus lots of lethal hits with their plague weapons that they have everywhere. The latest balance updates they had give them no serious changes to their codex, or at least not from a trying to make them weaker perspective. It seems it was a bit too close to their release for Games Workshop to do things of that sort of nature. For the options that are being put on the table, the Virulent Vectorium, the standard Plague Company one, does appear to be the most popular, that one giving sticky objectives and some useful stratagems, -1 damage being handy, and there's plenty of good ones that might help Mortarion. There's some nice damage dealer enhancements for the Lords of Contagion, and a 5+ Feel No Pain for the Death Guard Demon Prince too. Champions of Contagion also deal damage in a big way, being particularly good with Plague Marines led by characters, and then Mortarion's Hammer can support Demon Engines well, plus handing out easy affliction things which could be handy for Death Shroud Terminators to get in. For their standout units, there's a bunch of things that just seem flat out undercosted. The Death Shroud Terminators plus a Lord of Contagion is rather brutal. They can 6-inch deep strike against afflicted units and then go on to charge after that. Between 3 Death Shroud and a Lord of Contagion, they'll absolutely murder most things. Plague Marines jumping out of Rhinos with some combination of a Biologist Putrefier, Malignant Plague Caster, or maybe a Foul Blight Spawn is a pretty awesome and punchy central damage dealer for the army that will absolutely wreck something in the midboard. Fleeted bloat drones with the heavy blight launchers are undercosted gun turrets with some huge and general purpose strength 10 damage 3 firepower. At their current cost, it's never really a bad idea to have 3 of them in an army list, and they might be able to get some more efficient firepower with certain detachments or a Lord of Virulence, and to support them the blight haulers and the regular bloat drones are also fine. Mortarion himself is really quite powerful, big and tough with big melee damage and reactive moves on offer. That Demon Prince with the 5+ Feel No Pain in Virulent Vectorium is nice. Typhus is efficient with his mortal wounds, and he can farm command points pretty efficiently with a lone Tallyman, though he could also join a Plague Marine squad for some protection if desired. Then for a bit of forward deploy skirmishing, most lists take a couple of units of Poxwalkers at least, to be able to push out contagions into the midboard nice and early, and screen out enemy infiltrators and scouts. Between all that, it feels like they're just playing 40k on slightly easy mode compared with the rest at the moment. I feel like Games Workshop has at least a reasonable chance they might do an out-of-sequence balance patch as a result. It depends how much they see them as a problem. At the moment though, they're clearly one of the top armies power-wise, and I think I'd hope that they probably try and address them with points rises as opposed to rules changes. I feel like there's a lot of fun stuff and good combos in the codex, though it does feel quite clearly like a bunch of units do just need to pay a bit more points for their abilities, and hopefully they'll remain strong and balanced after that. Let me know your thoughts as to the stronger and weaker armies of Warhammer 40k though. Which armies would you rank higher or lower out of these here? I look forward to hearing your takes down in the comments, and I'll certainly be looking forward to checking out some tournament data and things when we get them, to take a better look as to what really happens in practice. Finally, before I go, I'll just cycle back to Titan's Terrain, the video sponsor for those interested, and talk a little bit more about their pop-up folding cardboard terrain system. I would say that this one's maybe one of the ones that's got more bigger pros and cons versus some others. Really quite easy to store and transport due to its folding system. It is far cheaper than a whole board worth of Games Workshop terrain, at least somewhat comparable to MDF, and like a lot of terrain it doesn't need any sort of painting or assembly. It's ready to go immediately if you don't have lots of spare hours worth of hobby effort. For some downsides, it is a bit less sturdy and hard wearing versus plastic and MDF, given it's made of cardboard and designed to fold flat. Certainly needs a bit more care looking after it, and you might struggle to place things in the upper floors of ruins. It won't have the same texture as, say, plastic stuff, and the grid layout can be a downside for 40k games. You can get some variety with rotating pieces, though it does lend itself to making some fire lanes. It might not be the worst idea just to have a few extra, say, ruin walls or something to break up a couple of those. It doesn't really make tournament approved layouts if that's what you're looking for, but in general it does alright for casual games. In any case, for their stuff, they've got 3 different sets, a Forgotten Furnace Chaos Foundry style one with some blasted factories and glowing runes, a more normal Shattered Hive one, a bombed out Hive City with a bunch of ruins and armoured containers, and then some slightly more verdant ruins in an overgrown capital, a set of ruins that might be appropriate for either fantasy or 40k purposes. Each of those also has an expansion centerpiece set, either a cathedral type thing for 2 of them, or an infernal spire for the factory one, and they're basically made out of 2 tiles pushed together to make one wider structure. In any case, check them out, links down in the video description if you'd like to give a look at their stuff, and a massive thank you to them for sponsoring the video. I'll leave this one there for now though. Let me know your thoughts on the 40k armies down in the comments. Which ones would you rate and which ones wouldn't you? Look forward to hearing all your ideas. If you've been enjoying the videos on the channel, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, there'll be new ones out each day. And if you'd like to support, check out the Patreon page linked in the video description. That's got a few benefits for supporters, entry to the regular prize giveaways, seeing occasional videos early, and things like names in the credits for bigger backers. A big thank you to anyone supporting there. In any case though, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.